Later that day, while Emma was tending to the ducklings, she noticed something strange. Poppy, her favorite duck, was missing. Emma searched the pen, her heart racing. She called softly, looking around the yard and nearby bushes. No sign of Poppy. Then she heard a faint, muffled quack. It came from the old well near the barn. Emma rushed to the well, peering into the darkness. There, at the bottom, weakly flapping her wings, was Poppy. "John!" she screamed, her voice full of panic. John came running, his heart dropping when he saw Emma's face. He grabbed a rope and a sturdy bucket, his thoughts frantically searching for ways to save his favorite duck. Translated with DeepL.com. Free version. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting soft hues of pink and orange across the rolling fields. The gentle hum of morning stirred life in the small farmhouse nestled on the outskirts of Maple Grove, a quiet town that had long been forgotten by the rush of the modern world. Here, time seemed to slow, lingering like the morning mist that hovered over the fields. Emma and John Harris had lived in this farmhouse for over 40 years. The paint on the old wooden walls had faded, and the porch creaked under the weight of time. But the house held stories within its walls, stories of laughter, loss, and love that had weathered countless seasons. Their farm was modest but bustling with life. 2 sturdy cows named Daisy and Belle, a pen full of noisy ducks and geese, a few mischievous rabbits, and a pair of stout pigs that grunted with contentment as they rooted in the earth. Emma rose early, as she did every morning, her movements practiced and precise. She slipped on her faded apron, its fabric soft from years of use, and padded quietly to the kitchen. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee soon filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of hay and earth that drifted in through the open window. John followed shortly after, his steps heavy but steady, the rhythm of a man who had spent his life walking the same paths. His weathered face softened with a smile as he saw Emma pouring his coffee, her hands as steady as the day he first met her. They exchanged few words. Their routine spoke volumes more than conversation ever could. After breakfast, they donned their work boots and stepped outside. The crisp morning air carried a slight chill, hinting at the coming change of seasons. The farm awakened around them. Geese honked impatiently, ducks flapped their wings, and the cows lowed softly, eager for their morning feed. Emma began with the ducks, her favorite among the animals. She greeted them with soft murmurs, scattering feed while they quacked noisily, vying for her attention. She checked their feathers, gently brushing off bits of dirt and straw, her fingers nimble and kind. One duck in particular, a plump, white-feathered one named Poppy, waddled after her closely, as if Emma were the sun around which she orbited. Meanwhile, John tended to the cows. He filled their troughs with fresh hay, checking the water to ensure it was clean. Daisy and Belle nuzzled him affectionately, their large eyes warm and trusting. John chuckled softly, patting their sturdy necks, his rough hands gentle against their smooth coats. The morning passed in a familiar rhythm, the kind of peace that settles into your bones. But beneath the surface of routine, life had a way of weaving in threads of change, unnoticed until they pulled taut. It was during the midday feed when Emma first noticed something wrong with Belle. The cow stood apart from Daisy, her head lowered, eyes dull and unfocused. She refused to eat, her usual eager demeanor replaced by lethargy. Emma's heart clenched with worry as she approached, her hand resting gently on Belle's broad side. The cow was warm, too warm. "John," Emma called, her voice edged with concern. John was by her side in moments, his brow furrowed as he examined Belle. He pressed his hand against her flank, feeling the unnatural heat. She showed signs of discomfort, shifting her weight uneasily. "She's sick," John muttered, more to himself than to Emma. Could be bloat or worse. They sprang into action, years of experience guiding their hands. John checked for signs of bloat, feeling Belle's distended side, while Emma fetched water mixed with a bit of oil, an old remedy passed down through generations. Belle barely sipped, her breathing labored. The hours stretched, the sun dipping lower as worry settled over the farm like an unwelcome guest. John paced, considering their options. The nearest veterinarian was miles away, and with their old truck out of commission, getting help wasn't easy. "I'll have to ride into town," John decided, his jaw set with determination. Emma nodded, her eyes never leaving Belle. "Hurry." John saddled their old horse, Dusty, the animal sensing his urgency as they galloped down the dirt road, leaving Emma behind to care for Belle. The farmhouse felt emptier than ever, the familiar creaks of the porch and distant sounds of the other animals offering little comfort. Emma sat beside Belle, stroking her gently, whispering words of encouragement as if the cow could understand. In many ways, she believed Belle did. The bond between them wasn't just one of caretaker and livestock. It was deeper, woven through years of shared days under the same sky. As night fell, casting long shadows across the fields, Emma lit a lantern and continued her vigil. The flickering light danced over Belle's face, reflecting the worry etched deeply into Emma's features. John returned just before midnight, his face grim, a veterinarian following close behind. The night was far from over, and the battle to save Belle had only just begun. The veterinarian, Dr. Samuel Green, was a man in his late 50s with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, the kind that came from years of dealing with both animal and human distress. He carried a battered leather bag filled with well-used instruments, remedies, and the faint, metallic scent of antiseptics. His arrival brought a flicker of hope to the farmhouse, though the night air remained thick with worry. Belle lay in the dim light of the barn lantern, her breathing shallow and uneven. Emma hovered close, her hand resting on the cow's forehead, whispering soothing words as if they could bridge the gap between fear and healing. John stood nearby, his face set in grim determination, though the tension in his clenched fists betrayed his anxiety. Dr. Green moved with efficiency, his hands steady as he examined Belle. He checked her vitals, feeling her pulse, inspecting her gums, and listening closely to her labored breaths with a stethoscope that had seen decades of use. "She's running a high fever," he murmured, his brow furrowed. "Could be an infection. Maybe mastitis or pneumonia." Emma's heart tightened. Belle was more than just a cow. She was part of their family, a creature whose quiet presence had been a constant comfort. Losing her was unthinkable. Dr. Green administered antibiotics and fluids, explaining each step in a calm, reassuring voice. He showed Emma and John how to monitor Belle's condition, how to check her temperature, and what signs to watch for during the critical hours ahead. "She's strong," he said softly, packing his bag. "But the next 24 hours will tell us everything." The doctor left, promising to return in the morning. His departure left a void, a fragile silence broken only by Belle's labored breaths and the distant sounds of the night. Crickets chirped outside, indifferent to the struggle unfolding within the barn. Emma refused to leave Belle's side. She sat on a wooden stool, her hand resting gently on the cow's flank, feeling the shallow rise and fall with each breath. John brought blankets and a thermos of coffee, settling beside his wife. They didn't speak much. Words felt too small for the weight of their emotions. Hours passed slowly, marked only by the changing positions of shadows cast by the lantern's flickering flame. Emma dozed off briefly, her head resting against Belle's side, only to wake with a start at every shift or sigh. John checked Belle's temperature as Dr. Green had shown them. Still high. He frowned, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool night air. "She'll pull through," he said quietly, more to convince himself than Emma. Dawn crept over the horizon, pale and hesitant, casting long fingers of light through the barn's wooden slats. Belle stirred slightly, her breaths a little less labored. Emma's heart fluttered with cautious hope. Dr. Green returned, his face breaking into a faint smile when he saw Belle's condition had improved. He administered another dose of antibiotics and checked her thoroughly. "She's a fighter," he said, patting Belle's side. "Keep doing what you're doing. She's not out of the woods yet, but she's on the right path." Relief washed over Emma and John like a warm tide. They had faced the longest night together, anchored by their love for Belle and each other. But life on the farm rarely allowed for rest. Later that afternoon, as Emma tended to the ducks, she noticed something strange. Poppy, her favorite duck, was missing. Emma searched the pen, her heart racing. She called out softly, scanning the yard and the nearby bushes. No sign of Poppy. Then she heard it, a faint, muffled quacking. It was coming from the old well near the barn. Emma rushed over, peering down into the darkness. There, at the bottom, flapping her wings weakly, was Poppy. "John!" she screamed, her voice filled with panic. John came running, his heart sinking as he saw Emma's face. He grabbed a rope and a sturdy bucket, his mind racing with ways to rescue the beloved duck. They had faced the darkness of one night, and now a new challenge awaited. But Emma and John were nothing if not resilient. Their love for their animals was matched only by their determination to protect them. The fight to save Poppy had begun. John secured the rope tightly around the old oak post near the well, testing its strength with a few firm tugs. The wooden boards creaked under his weight as he leaned over the stone edge, peering into the dimness where Poppy flapped weakly, her quacks growing fainter. Emma stood beside him, her face etched with worry, clutching a flashlight that barely pierced the well's depth. "We don't have much time," John muttered, knotting the rope securely around his waist. "Be careful," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. John descended slowly, his boots scraping against the damp stones. The cold air grew heavier as he lowered himself deeper, the flashlight's beam dancing across the mossy walls. Emma held her breath, her hands white-knuckled around the rope, her heart pounding in rhythm with each slip and slide of John's descent. Reaching the bottom, John crouched beside Poppy, gently scooping her fragile body into his arms. She was soaked, feathers matted, her tiny heart racing against his palm. He cradled her carefully, securing her against his chest as he signaled Emma to start pulling. The ascent was harder, the added weight of Poppy straining Emma's grip. Her arms burned with effort, but she didn't falter. Inch by inch, John and Poppy rose, until strong hands reached over the edge, pulling them to safety. Emma wrapped Poppy in a warm towel, her relief spilling over in tears as she examined the shivering duck. John collapsed beside her, exhausted but relieved. They worked together to dry and warm Poppy, using gentle hands and whispered reassurances. She'd survived the fall, but recovery would take time. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the farm, Emma and John sat on the porch, Poppy nestled safely between them. "We did it," John said softly. Emma nodded, her heart full. They had faced fear, uncertainty, and darkness, but together, they had overcome. Life on the farm was never easy, but it was filled with moments that mattered, moments of love, courage, and resilience. And as the stars emerged, twinkling like silent witnesses, Emma and John knew they were exactly where they belonged. The days following Poppy's rescue settled into a fragile calm. Belle's health continued to improve under Emma and John's diligent care, and Poppy, though shaken, gradually returned to her lively self, waddling around the yard with a slight limp, a small reminder of her misadventure. However, the tranquility didn't erase the weight of recent events. The farm, with all its routines, the feeding of the animals, the cleaning of pens, the milking of Belle, held echoes of fear and relief intertwined. Life had shown Emma and John how fragile it could be, how easily it could slip through their fingers like water from a leaky pail. One crisp morning, as the first frost painted delicate patterns on the windows, John noticed something strange in the barn. He was hauling hay when he saw deep scratches on the wooden door, far too high to be from any of their animals. His brow furrowed as he traced the marks with rough fingertips, feeling the jagged edges. Emma joined him, a basket of fresh eggs in hand. "What is it?" she asked, following his gaze. John hesitated. Not sure. Could be a raccoon. Maybe even a stray dog. But his voice lacked conviction. The scratches felt deliberate, almost like a warning etched into the wood. That night, they secured the barn tightly, double-checking latches and reinforcing the old hinges. The wind howled outside, rattling loose shutters and carrying the faintest sounds of distant rustling. Emma found herself waking often, straining to hear beyond the creaks and groans of the old farmhouse. At dawn, they discovered more scratches, not just on the barn door, but along the chicken coop's frame and even on the feed shed. Tracks in the dirt, too faint to be identified clearly, circled the yard. Concern settled over the farm like an unwelcome guest. They were used to the occasional wild animal wandering close, but this felt different. Predatory, yes, but also persistent. John decided to set up a lantern outside, its flickering glow casting long shadows across the frost-kissed ground. He kept his rifle propped by the door, though he hoped it would never be needed. Meanwhile, Emma focused on the animals, her hands gentle yet firm as she checked for signs of distress. Belle nuzzled her affectionately, her big brown eyes filled with trust. Poppy stuck close, as if sensing Emma's unease. One evening, as twilight bled into darkness, Emma heard it. A soft, guttural growl from beyond the tree line. She froze on the porch, her heart pounding like a drum. John was beside her in seconds, his hand steady on her shoulder. "Stay here," he whispered, grabbing the lantern and his rifle. Emma watched as he disappeared into the growing dark, the lantern's glow bobbing like a will-o'-the-wisp. Minutes felt like hours, the silence pressing in until she could barely breathe. Then a shout. Emma raced toward the sound, her legs moving before fear could stop her. She found John near the old well, his face pale but determined. "It was a coyote," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. "A big one, but something scared it off before I got close." Emma's eyes darted to the shadows. What could scare off a coyote? John didn't answer. His silence spoke louder than words. Back at the house, they sat in the flickering firelight, the unease settling between them like a third presence. But amidst the fear was something stronger, resilience. They had faced illness, loss, and now an unknown threat. Yet side by side they endured. The farm was more than land and livestock. It was their heart, their history, and they would protect it, whatever came next. The night after John's encounter with the coyote hung heavy over the farmhouse like a thick, unyielding blanket. The air outside was unnervingly still, broken only by the occasional groan of the wind slipping through the trees like a restless spirit. Emma lay awake, her eyes tracing the faint cracks on the ceiling, listening for footsteps, for growls, for anything that didn't belong. John had fallen into a light, restless sleep in the old armchair near the door, his rifle resting against the wall within arm's reach. The embers in the fireplace glowed faintly, casting shifting shadows across his weathered face. Emma finally slipped out of bed, her bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. She pulled on her heavy knit sweater and crept to the window. The yard beyond was bathed in pale moonlight, the barn and animal pens cloaked in silvery stillness. But something was wrong. The lantern John had hung near the barn was out. Her heart stuttered. John had filled it with fresh oil, made sure the wick was trimmed. There was no reason for it to be dark. Unless, she moved quickly, shaking John's shoulder gently but firmly. "John," she whispered, her voice tight with urgency. "The lantern's out." He was awake instantly, years of farming life having honed his instincts sharp as a blade. He stood, grabbed the rifle, and followed her to the door. "Stay here," he said again, though his voice was softer this time, touched with something deeper. Fear not just for himself, but for her. Emma didn't argue. She watched as he stepped outside, his silhouette quickly swallowed by the night. She counted the seconds, her breath fogging the cold window pane. 1 minute, 2, 3. A sharp bark shattered the silence. A cry of alarm, not from John, but from the animals. The geese were honking furiously, their wings flapping in chaos. Emma didn't think. She grabbed the heavy flashlight from the kitchen counter and bolted outside. The beam of light cut through the dark, landing on John near the chicken coop, rifle raised. Beyond him, movement, a blur of shadow and fur. Coyotes, but more than one this time. Emma ran to his side, her flashlight's beam steady despite her trembling hands. The coyotes, their eyes reflecting like shards of green glass, hesitated at the sudden burst of light. John fired a warning shot into the ground, the sharp crack echoing across the fields. The animals scattered, disappearing into the woods as quickly as they'd come. But the damage was done. The chicken coop door hung open, its latch broken. Feathers floated through the air like snowflakes. 2 hens were missing, their absence marked only by small, dark stains on the ground. Emma sank to her knees, her breath ragged. John stood beside her, silent, the rifle still in his grip. They worked until dawn, repairing the coop, checking on the animals, reinforcing every door and latch. Their hands were raw and cold, their bodies exhausted, but they didn't stop, couldn't stop. When the sun finally rose, painting the sky with soft pinks and oranges, the farm looked almost peaceful again. But Emma and John knew better. The peace was fragile. Inside, with coffee warming their hands, John finally spoke. "They're getting bolder." Emma nodded, staring into her mug. "We need to be ready." But it wasn't just coyotes they were preparing for. It was the realization that life, no matter how quiet and simple, was never free from shadows. Still, as John reached over and took her hand, Emma felt a flicker of something stronger than fear. Hope, because no matter how dark the night, the sun always rose. The days after the coyote attack were marked by a tense, uneasy quiet. Emma and John moved through their routines with mechanical precision, their bodies running on habit while their minds remained on high alert. The animals sensed the shift too. Belle was restless in her stall, flicking her ears at every sound, while the geese had grown unusually quiet, clustering together as if for protection. John spent more time patrolling the perimeter of their land, repairing fences, reinforcing gates, and setting up crude deterrents. He installed makeshift noise traps, tin cans strung together with wire, designed to rattle if disturbed. Emma focused on the animals, her hands gentle but her heart heavy. She paid extra attention to Belle, brushing her with long, soothing strokes, whispering words of comfort she wasn't sure were meant more for the cow or for herself. But even with all their preparations, they couldn't stop what was coming. It was a bitterly cold morning when Emma noticed something wrong. She had gone to the barn early, her breath forming little clouds in the frosty air. Belle didn't greet her with the usual soft lowing. Instead, she was lying down, her body unnervingly still. Emma's heart clenched. She rushed to Belle's side, dropping to her knees in the straw. The cow's breathing was shallow, her eyes dull and distant. Emma ran her hands over Belle's side, feeling the heat radiating from her body. A fever, burning hot against the cold morning air. "John!" Emma's voice broke as she called for him. John was there in seconds, his face paling when he saw Belle's condition. They worked quickly, checking for signs of injury, infection, anything that could explain the sudden illness. But Belle's condition deteriorated rapidly. She couldn't stand, and her breathing grew labored. "We need help," John said grimly. He grabbed the old landline, they didn't have much use for cell phones out here, and called the nearest veterinarian, a woman named Dr. Lewis, who'd treated their animals before. She promised to come as soon as she could, but it would be hours. Emma stayed by Belle's side, refusing to leave even for a moment. She wiped the cow's forehead with cool, damp cloths, whispered soothing words, and stroked her fur, as if sheer will and love could pull her back from the brink. John brought blankets, trying to keep Belle warm, though sweat matted her coat. They administered what little they could, a mix of fluids and electrolytes they kept on hand for emergencies, but nothing seemed to help. When Dr. Lewis finally arrived, her face was grave the moment she laid eyes on Belle. She examined her carefully, checking her temperature, heart rate, and breathing. "It's a severe infection," Dr. Lewis said softly. "Could be from a wound we missed or an internal issue. We'll need antibiotics, fast, and she's dehydrated. We'll do everything we can." But the unspoken words hung in the air. They worked through the day and into the night, rotating shifts to stay with Belle. John administered injections under Dr. Lewis's guidance while Emma coaxed Belle to drink small sips of water. The barn became their whole world, a space filled with the scent of hay, the low hum of whispered prayers, and the constant, rhythmic sound of Belle's labored breathing. At one point, John stepped outside, unable to hold back the wave of emotion threatening to break. He stood under the vast, starless sky, his breath misting in the cold, and let the tears fall. Emma found him there, her own face streaked with silent grief. "She's strong," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "She's going to make it." John didn't answer, just pulled her into a tight embrace. They stood like that for a long time, finding solace in the warmth of each other's presence. The next morning, as the first pale light crept over the horizon, Belle stirred. She lifted her head slightly, her eyes clearing just a bit. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A sign. Hope. For the first time in days, Emma smiled through her tears. Belle wasn't out of danger yet, but she was fighting, and so were they, together. Belle's slow recovery brought a fragile sense of relief to the farmhouse. Though she was still weak, each day showed small signs of progress. Steadier breaths, the occasional flick of her tail, even a soft, low moo when Emma entered the barn. These little victories stitched hope back into John and Emma's hearts, fragile threads woven between exhaustion and gratitude. But life on the farm, much like the seasons, never paused. The animals needed care, fences needed mending, and the rhythm of daily chores resumed its relentless beat. Emma found comfort in the routine, though her heart remained tender from the recent ordeal. One bright morning, with the sky painted in strokes of orange and pink, Emma went to feed the ducks by the old well near the garden. The flock waddled eagerly toward her, quacking with anticipation. But as she scattered the grain, a sudden realization struck her. One duck was missing. Daisy, Emma's favorite. Unlike the others, Daisy was curious and bold, always straying a little farther, her soft white feathers easy to spot even from a distance. But today, there was no sign of her. Emma's heart clenched with an all-too-familiar dread. She called out, her voice echoing slightly in the cool morning air, but there was no answering quack. She searched the yard, checked behind the barn, even peeked inside the chicken coop, hoping Daisy had simply wandered off. Nothing. Panic prickled at the edges of her mind. She rushed back to the house, where John was repairing a broken gate latch. "John," she panted, "Daisy's gone." John set down his tools immediately. He'd seen this fear before, the way loss lingered like a shadow, especially after what they'd been through with Belle. Without wasting time, they grabbed flashlights and began a thorough search. They scoured every corner of the property, calling Daisy's name, their voices growing hoarse with effort. The other ducks grew restless, sensing the tension. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher, casting long shadows across the fields. Then Emma heard it, a faint, muffled quacking. She froze, holding her breath to listen more closely. The sound was faint, but it was definitely Daisy. Emma's eyes darted around, trying to pinpoint the source. Her gaze fell on the old stone well near the garden, its weathered wooden cover slightly askew. No. She sprinted toward it, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Peering over the edge, she shone her flashlight down into the darkness. There at the bottom was Daisy, wet, frightened, but alive. Her small wings flapped weakly against the cold stone walls, her feathers matted from the damp. "Oh, Daisy," Emma whispered, tears welling in her eyes. John was beside her in an instant, assessing the situation with a grin set to his jaw. "We'll get her out," he said firmly. They quickly gathered supplies, a sturdy rope, an old wooden crate just big enough for Daisy, and a pulley system John rigged together with practiced hands. Emma's hands trembled as she tied knots, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. John insisted on being the one to go down. He lowered himself carefully, his boots scraping against the mossy stones. The well was deeper than they'd realized, the damp air growing colder as he descended. Emma held the rope tightly, her knuckles white, her heart pounding with every creak of the pulley. Almost there, John's voice echoed faintly. Emma leaned over, watching as John reached out, his large, calloused hands gently scooping Daisy into the crate. Daisy let out a weak quack, her eyes wide with fear but still filled with life. Slowly, carefully, Emma pulled the rope, straining with all her strength. Inch by inch, the crate rose, Daisy's small form huddled inside. When it finally reached the top, Emma grabbed it, cradling Daisy against her chest, tears streaming down her face. John climbed out moments later, breathless and muddy, but smiling through the grime. "She's okay," Emma whispered, rocking Daisy gently. Back in the warmth of the farmhouse, they dried Daisy's feathers, fed her warm mash, and wrapped her in soft towels. She shivered for a while but gradually relaxed under their care. That night, as Emma sat by the fire with Daisy nestled in her lap, John placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We saved her," he said softly. Emma nodded, her heart swelling with relief and love. Not just for Daisy, but for John, for the life they'd built, fragile yet resilient. In a world filled with loss and fear, sometimes saving just one small life was enough to remind them of all the reasons to keep fighting. The farm seemed to settle into a fragile peace after Daisy's rescue. Belle was steadily gaining strength, Daisy was back with the flock, albeit a bit more cautious, and John and Emma found themselves breathing easier. The rhythm of life resumed, marked by early mornings, hard work, and quiet evenings by the fire. But peace in the countryside was never permanent. It was always fragile, like the thin layer of frost that covered the ground at dawn, beautiful but easily shattered. It was a cold, moonless night when Emma first heard it. She'd woken to the sound of faint scratching, soft, like claws against wood. At first, she thought it was her imagination, a leftover fragment from a restless dream. But then it came again, louder this time. A slow, deliberate scraping. John stirred beside her as Emma sat up, her heart thudding in her chest. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. John was already awake, reaching for the old rifle they kept by the door. His face was tense, shadowed in the faint glow of the dying embers from the hearth. They moved quietly, slipping on coats and boots, not bothering to turn on any lights. Darkness was their ally out here. They stepped outside, the cold air biting at their skin, the night eerily silent except for the faint rustle of wind through the trees. John's flashlight cut through the darkness, casting long, jagged beams across the fields. The barn stood in the distance, a hulking shape under the faint starlight. Everything looked normal, but Emma's instincts screamed otherwise. Then they saw it, a figure dark, hunched, moving near the chicken coop. It wasn't an animal. Too tall, too deliberate. John raised the rifle, his voice low and steady. "Hey, who's there?" The figure froze for a split second, then bolted. Without thinking, John took off after it, his boots pounding against the frozen ground. Emma hesitated for a heartbeat, then followed, adrenaline surging through her veins. The flashlight beam bounced wildly as she ran, catching glimpses of movement ahead, shadows darting between trees, flashes of dark clothing. John was fast, but whoever it was knew the land, or didn't care about the dangers lurking in the dark. They darted through a gap in the fence, disappearing into the dense woods beyond the property line. John skidded to a stop at the edge of the trees, breathing hard. He didn't follow. Emma caught up moments later, her chest burning from the cold air and exertion. "Who was that?" she gasped. John shook his head, his jaw clenched tight. "I don't know. But it wasn't just some trespasser." The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken fears. They returned to the farm, checking the animals first. The coop had been tampered with. Someone had tried to break the lock. Thankfully, the chickens were unharmed, but the damage was clear. This wasn't just random. Someone had been watching, waiting. The next day, John reinforced the fences, added extra locks to the barn and coop, and even set up trail cameras along the property's perimeter. Emma kept a closer eye on the animals, her nerves frayed like worn rope. Days passed without another incident, but the sense of safety was gone. Shadows seemed darker, noises sharper. They slept with the rifle within arm's reach, and Emma found herself waking at the slightest creak. Then, one morning, they found the message. It was scrawled on a piece of old wood, propped up against the barn door. The handwriting was jagged, uneven. "This isn't your land." Emma's hands trembled as she read it, the cold seeping deeper than her skin. John's face was a mask of fury and fear. "This is our home," he growled, ripping the sign down and tossing it into the fire later that night. But the words burned hotter than the flames, branding themselves into their minds. The farm was no longer just their sanctuary. It was a battleground. The days after the ominous message passed like a gathering storm, slow, heavy, and filled with a suffocating tension that wrapped itself around the farm like an invisible fog. John and Emma went about their routines, but every creak of wood, every rustle of leaves, seemed amplified, stirring a restless unease. John became quieter, his usual calm replaced by a sharp edge of vigilance. He checked the fences twice a day, kept the rifle closer, and started carrying a hunting knife on his belt even when tending to the animals. Emma, though just as wary, fought to hold on to their sense of normalcy. She clung to the rhythm of feeding the livestock, brushing Belle with careful strokes, and humming softly to Daisy as if her voice could ward off the darkness creeping around them. But nothing could prepare them for what came next. It was late afternoon when the sky darkened abruptly, thick clouds rolling in like a curtain pulled across the horizon. The wind picked up, sharp and cold, carrying with it the distant scent of rain and something else, something metallic like rusted iron. John was in the barn, repairing a broken latch, when he heard Emma scream. He dropped the hammer without a thought, sprinting across the muddy yard toward the sound. His heart pounded like a drum, each beat fueled by fear. Emma was near the well, her face pale, eyes wide with horror. She was pointing, her hand trembling. John followed her gaze, and his blood ran cold. The well's wooden cover had been pried open, the boards splintered and scattered, and just barely visible, floating on the surface of the dark water below, was a feather. A white feather, stained with something dark. "Daisy," Emma whispered, her voice breaking. Without hesitation, John dropped to his knees and peered into the well. The light was dim, but he could see movement, weak, sluggish ripples disturbing the water. "She's alive," he muttered, his mind racing. They didn't have time to think. John grabbed a rope from the barn, tying it securely around his waist. Emma anchored the other end around a sturdy post, her hands trembling as she fastened the knot. "Be careful," she pleaded, her eyes glistening with fear. John gave her a reassuring nod, though his heart felt like it might burst from his chest. He lowered himself into the well, the cold seeping through his clothes, the rough stones scraping his hands. The air grew damp and heavy as he descended, the walls closing in around him. When he finally reached the water, he could see Daisy more clearly, her small body struggling to stay afloat, her feathers matted and soaked. She was exhausted, barely able to keep her head above the surface. "Hang on, girl," John whispered, reaching for her. It was harder than he expected. The water was icy, sapping his strength. But he managed to hook one arm around Daisy, holding her tightly against his chest. With his other hand, he tugged the rope, Emma's signal to pull him up. The ascent was agonizing. His muscles burned, and Daisy was heavier than she'd ever been, her body waterlogged and limp. But Emma's determination above fueled his own, and inch by inch they made it to the top. Emma grabbed Daisy the moment John was close enough, pulling her free with a sob of relief. John hauled himself out next, collapsing onto the ground, gasping for breath. Daisy was alive, but barely. Her eyes were half closed, and her breathing was shallow. "We need to warm her up," John said, snapping into action despite his exhaustion. They rushed Daisy to the house, wrapping her in towels, gently drying her feathers, and placing her near the fireplace. Emma whispered softly to her, stroking her head, tears mingling with the soot on her face. Hours passed. The storm outside raged, but inside, the world had narrowed to a single fragile heartbeat. And then, as dawn's pale light crept through the windows, Daisy stirred. She let out a weak, rasping quack. Emma laughed and cried at the same time, cradling the little duck in her arms as if she were the most precious thing in the world. John sat beside them, his hand resting on Emma's shoulder, his heart finally easing. They'd faced the darkness again, and this time they'd won. But deep down, they both knew the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The dawn that followed Daisy's rescue felt different, fragile, like glass poised on the edge of shattering. The storm had passed, leaving the farm soaked and battered, but standing. Much like John and Emma themselves, Daisy had survived. That small, miraculous victory pulsed like a heartbeat in their home, warm and steady. She nestled in a woven basket near the hearth, her feathers fluffed as she regained strength, blinking at Emma with soft, grateful eyes. But the well told another story. John couldn't shake the image of the broken cover, the deliberate splintering of wood. It hadn't been an accident. Someone had done this. Someone wanted to hurt them or what they loved most. The thought burned in his mind as he stood at the edge of the farm later that morning, surveying the fences. The boards were intact, but the ground near the gate bore unfamiliar footprints, deep in the softened earth from last night's rain. They weren't his. They weren't Emma's. John's jaw tightened. Emma found him there, silent and still, his gaze fixed on the tracks. She didn't have to ask. She knew. "It's not over, is it?" she whispered, slipping her hand into his. John shook his head. No, but the fear that had gripped them before was different now. It wasn't paralyzing. It was sharp, focused. A determination forged in the fires of every loss they'd faced, and every victory they'd clawed back. That afternoon, they fortified the farm. John reinforced the barn doors with new locks, repaired the well's cover with thick, solid planks, and set up lanterns around the perimeter, their soft glow ready to pierce the night. Emma crafted makeshift charms from scraps of ribbon and twine, tying them to the fence posts. Not because she believed in magic, but because symbols mattered. They reminded her, and anyone watching, that this was their land, their life, and it would not be taken without a fight. The sun dipped low, casting the farm in gold and shadow. And then, just as the horizon swallowed the last sliver of light, they heard it. Footsteps. Not the soft padding of an animal. Not the familiar rhythm of their own. John grabbed the rifle. Emma stood beside him, holding the lantern high, her eyes fierce. They moved together, hearts pounding, muscles tense, following the sound toward the barn. The light flickered against the dark wood, casting long, thin shadows. And there, by the hay bales, stood a figure. Not some faceless stranger. It was Mark, the neighbor who'd always been too friendly. The one who'd borrowed tools and never returned them. The one who'd accidentally let the gate swing open last fall, scattering their geese. But this time it wasn't clumsy neglect. His face twisted in something darker, resentment, maybe jealousy. "You think you're better than the rest of us," Mark sneered, stepping forward. "With your perfect farm, your perfect life." John didn't lower the rifle. "What did you do?" Mark laughed bitterly. "Taught you a lesson. Took what mattered, just to see if you'd notice." Emma's breath caught. Daisy, the well, Belle's illness. Mark had been behind it all. But instead of fear, a fierce, protective rage surged through her. She stepped in front of John, her voice steady and sharp. "You don't scare us," she said simply. Mark faltered. For all his bravado, he hadn't expected defiance. He'd expected fear. John stepped forward now, lowering the rifle slightly, not as a sign of weakness but control. "Get off our land," he said quietly. "And don't come back." Something in John's voice, calm but unyielding, made Mark hesitate. He glanced at the lantern's flickering light, at Emma's unwavering stance, and then turned, disappearing into the darkness. They didn't follow. They didn't need to. They had already won. In the days that followed, life found its rhythm again. Belle grew stronger, her eyes clear and bright. Daisy quacked with renewed vigor, waddling after Emma like a feathery shadow. John repaired the final broken fence post one crisp morning as the sun rose, casting long beams of light across the land. Emma brought him coffee, her smile soft but full of something unbreakable. They had faced loss, fear, and even betrayal. But standing there, side by side, they knew the truth. Home wasn't just a place. It was a battle fought and won, over and over, in the quiet moments and the storms alike. And as long as they had each other, the heart of their farm, their family, would never fade. Not even in the darkest night.